There we go. That's what we want. Okay. Welcome everyone who has joined us so far, especially if you came last week, and if you didn't, welcome to the race webinar series. Today is going to be on training the gut and carbohydrate loading with Kelsie. And if you want to open the next slide, Kel. So just to introduce you, if you're not familiar with total endurance nutrition and this is kind of your first introduction to us, we are a team of nutritionists and even a dietitian as well. They're all pretty dedicated to try and get you fueling correctly for your training, getting the most out of all the training that you put in so you can actually optimize your performance. So hopefully you'll come to next week's as well, but throughout this month you'll take something away, and then if you need any more personalized advice, feel free to get in touch with one of us. I'll let Kelsie introduce herself further now as she's taking today's talk, and you can talk to us through the question and answer box as well, and I'll be able to feed that back to Kels. So take it away, Kels.
Perfect. So yeah, thanks, Em. Welcome everyone to our webinar series this week. Obviously we're on number 2 of the sessions that we have going on for the remainder of this month, almost 2 more weeks after this. So for a bit of background, for anyone who's on the call and hasn't come across 10, I am one of the, I think now 9 nutritionists at Total Endurance Nutrition. My background has been in sports nutrition and physiology specifically. I went through the program of sport and exercise science, and as I carried on studying through to my PhD, I then specialised on nutrition. I now work as a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, specifically again in sports nutrition and physiology. I'm a registered nutritionist and also an endurance athlete myself. So whilst we all have the knowledge, we also, I think everyone has at least done 1 or 2 triathlons or participates in endurance sport in some capacity as their first sport. So we're quite unique in the fact that we also train and live very similar to most of you that are on this call. So my passion is all about making sure people are fueling adequately, but I also like to think that I like to strike the balance between fueling correctly, but also still then managing social life and having that kind of balance that triathlon can sometimes knock out of you. So that's kind of my philosophy and passion when it comes to nutrition. So like we've already kind of highlighted, we've got 3 talks. This is number 2 of 4. And today I'm going to be talking all things training the gut and carbohydrate loading today. So we're going to talk about initially the importance of carbohydrate loading and why that's important and why do we do that. We're going to talk about some strategies that me and Em have used as nutritionists and how we kind of carbohydrate load to maximize our performance. So you're going to have some real life examples. I'm also going to talk to you about the importance of training the gut. So these 2 things kind of come hand in hand, which is why they've been put together today. So I'm going to talk to you about, okay, this is what we need, but also there's a lot of steps in place that you need to do before you can kind of reach some of these guidelines that I'm going to talk to you about today.
Okay, so Kels, talk us through them. Why are we needing to carb load in the first place?
So carb loading has all come from this understanding of science that we can store carbohydrates within our muscles, but actually, if we increase the amount of carbohydrates that we can consume, that is directly impacting the amount of carbohydrates that we can store in our muscles and therefore can aid our performance. So we have carbohydrates stored in the form of glycogen, and the stores that we have right now are very limited. So you can kind of see in the picture here, we have storage sites at the liver and also at the muscle. And depending on a few factors, there's slightly different amounts of glycogen that get stored in there. We also store fat, but we predominantly want to be trying to use, or we will get a lot of our kind of energy that we use to perform and race at the very top end from our carbohydrate stores. So ultimately, if you're able to carb load, you're going to delay your fatigue, and you're going to slow down the rate at which you might slow down, hopefully not slow down, towards the end of the race as well. So carb loading basically allows us to ensure that these kind of tanks, I call them, are topped up, like putting petrol in a car. We're topping up the amount of glycogen that we have in our muscles, ready to do the exercise that we want at a maximum speed. And you might go, well, does this actually make a difference? People always say to me, well, I feel fine. And that's great if you feel fine day to day in training. But when we look at the science, it's been shown that actually, and this is a lovely little review that kind of summarizes the impact that carbohydrate loading can have, but it can be as big as a 2 to 3% improvement in performance if you carb load appropriately and in accordance to the research. And to give you some numbers in terms of the context of what that 2 to 3% might be, if you're looking to maybe do something like a 12-hour Ironman, that could be around 14 minutes you're saving just from getting to the start line with all of your systems topped up appropriately and your glycogen stores at the optimum level they can be at. So carb loading definitely will have a direct impact on performance. And when you think of all the marginal gains and all the other things that you might spend money on, like your disc wheels, having the best aero helmet, for example, just getting your carb loading right will help considerably for performance on race day. So it's really, yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's also much cheaper to do. You might not think it when you do your local food shop with the cost of living crisis right now, but I guarantee getting your carb load in for 20 quid will be much cheaper than that pointy aero helmet, which I don't know how much they are, like 150 quid or something like that these days. And probably has more of a benefit too. So,
I was going to say, so using that like review to us. So we've obviously had lots of research that's been done over the years to get to this point. So yeah, talk us through what were the steps in getting to where we are now with knowing what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get asked this question a lot when I kind of talk about carb loading. So I thought today I'm going to actually start from scratch, and we'll go all the way back to around the 1960s now, where we took our kind of first kind of muscle biopsies where we could actually quantify the amount of glycogen that's in people's muscles. So that's stored carbohydrate. We can take muscle samples and we can find out how much glycogen is in there. And when they started to learn actually, if people have a higher carbohydrate diet, they were actually seeing more glycogen within those muscle storages. They began to learn actually the higher your diet was, the higher in carbs that diet was, the better people were performing and the less they were actually fatiguing. So that's where it's originally come from. And I guess the first approach to carbohydrate loading, and this is why I'm kind of bringing this up, because people say, oh, I've seen protocols that are maybe like 4, 5, maybe 6 days of loading, is originally we used to use an approach, not me personally, because this is back in the 80s, but originally they used to use an approach where actually people would completely deplete the stores that we have available within our muscles by doing something, an exercise protocol that was really hard about 7 days out from the race. What you would then do is you would almost restrict carbohydrates for maybe 3 days. So you stay in that very, very low glycogen state that you might have, or the low amount of carbohydrates that are stored within your muscle. You would then have maybe around 3 days, some a little bit longer, of a very, very high carbohydrate diet. Now, the reason for doing this is they actually thought that your muscles would then become a little bit more sensitive to the glycogen that you were having due to that restriction, and therefore you could actually top up those stores even more than if you didn't do the kind of fatigue and process restriction and then 3 days of the high carbohydrate diet. This also recommended that athletes didn't do any exercise in the 7 days leading into the race. So that's kind of where this approach all stemmed from. Obviously, there are a lot of side effects to that, and I guess we're starting to move, well, we have moved away from these original philosophies around carbohydrate loading and this strategy that is quite good, but comes with many side effects. So For starters, most people, especially if you're doing longer distance racing, you're not going to want to be doing a really hard session 7 days before you're supposed to be racing. If you're then having to restrict carbohydrates, that's potentially leading to poor recovery. Yes, we need protein, but we also need carbohydrates to try and replenish those stores that we've lost. Athletes are recommended not to exercise the week of the race, which is a problem in itself, because if like most endurance athletes can't sit still for too long, let alone a whole week before a race. As a result of doing the kind of low carb, it meant that people were having a bit higher fat intake, which we know can kind of wreak havoc with things like GI issues, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple of slides' time. So overall, whilst I did know that this process is quite effective, it wasn't really realistic, and some of the side effects actually were outweighing the benefit of doing this quite aggressive, quite restrictive strategy for carbohydrate loading.
Okay, cool. So now you've kind of taken us through the history of what we shouldn't do anymore because we have options. What is this new approach that we kind of know works better? And yeah, what does it look like?
Yeah, so I guess the new approach now, and the most common one that we see, is actually for the majority of well-trained athletes, a carb load of 1 to 2, maybe 3 days will perfectly suffice to maximize those glycogen stores that we need and have all those benefits of performance that I've showed you about carb loading potentially having this big impact. So in terms of what the new guidelines now state, obviously long course and short course races is slightly different because of the durations. But when we think about short course or sprint to standard distance, having anywhere in the region of 6 grams per kilogram of body weight. So we'll give an example on the next slide of what that might look like and how to work that out if you're not too sure. Or if you're doing longer courses, so your T100, your 70.3s, or your full distance Ironmans, that's around 10 to 12 grams of carbohydrates per 1 kilogram of body weight that you weigh. So for somebody that weighs 100 kilos, for example, they would be wanting to basically have a kilo of carbohydrates as part of their carbohydrate loading. And this is 24 to 72 hours prior to the race. If you're having it just doing 24 hours, that means that you can work towards the kind of top end of the ranges we've mentioned. If you're working more towards like doing it 2 to 3 days, that's when you can start to push more towards the bottom end of the recommendations. This obviously comes with the caveat of every individual is different. So whilst it might be ideal to have 12 grams per kilo, you might find that maybe for the first few times that you try this or the first year of racing, that actually you could only get to 9 or 10 where you feel quite comfortable. And over the time, that strategy will then develop so you can maybe reach a little bit higher and go to 11, 12 grams per kilo of body weight. So what might that look like? I thought a nice way to kind of break up me speaking at you for an hour is for me and Em, I guess, to talk through what we do and how we kind of use our what we do to use our carbohydrate loading strategies. I'm going to assume they're probably a little bit different because obviously I weigh a little bit more than Emily. So the approaches that we might use are slightly different. So Em, do you want to tell us about how you kind of approach carbohydrate loading in terms of how long, how much, and maybe your kind of staples to begin with?
Yeah, so for me, it was a matter of trial and error. And I tried a 2-day carb load. I mostly kind of go for like 70.3 kind of distances. So trying to fuel myself for like 5 hours, 5 to 6 hours, thinking about the actual race. So I've done 2-day carb loads before. And for me, I could do it and I was fine. But I found that when I played around with it, I was a lot more comfortable if I just did a 1-day carb load. And I've also tried working between like 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight, and for me the sweet spot seems to be 10. So that's kind of how, and it was just a matter of trying for different races and for training and different like bike rides and stuff, and yeah, trial and error. And fueling wise, oh, we've got any favorites? I mean, I'm
what are your staples?
a porridge person, like to start off my carb load, and then it just varies throughout the day, but there's always going to be some pasta in there, different like types of snacks and stuff. Got a little bit of saurine malt loaf, and I think you introduced that few years ago, Kelsey.
Probably.
When we were in uni, you introduced that.
I was obsessed with that stuff, so that doesn't surprise me.
Right. And yeah, so what about you? How did you get to know your strategy?
Yeah, so I was the exact same, and I just really want to emphasize here because I don't want people to go away and they may be racing this week and go, right, I've got to reach 10 to 12 grams per kilo of body weight on Saturday for the race on Sunday. These strategies have taken months, if not years, to develop and play around with. You'll want to make sure you're testing these on like your B and C races and even on like big brick weekends where actually you'll benefit from having the extra carbs anyway because you've got a big weekend. And then the weeks following, you can then work up, work down, swap in and out things. So it is quite a lengthy process. So don't try and do this straight away. So I'm actually quite similar to Em. Until a few years ago, probably did a 3-day carb load. But I just found that I preferred doing it more aggressively over one day. I have 11 grams per kilo, so very similar to Em. I'm a little bit heavier, so I aim for 715. I won't say it's bang on 715, but I know as long as I'm within that number thereabouts, I'm pretty much where I'm comfortable and where I like to be. I'm not so big on the kind of pasta. I tend to push more to rice because I find that a little bit less filling. As you'll learn that like 10 to 12 can be a lot of food. What else? I love Oreos on the day before as well. And the same as Emily, I always start the day with porridge, and orange juice is handy as well to kind of have throughout the day. So they're kind of my carb load staples, I would say, for carb loading.
I say another high carb snack that you introduced me to as well, or emphasized, was giant straws. That's another favorite of both. Where I know I'm speaking on behalf of us both there.
That is an elite training snack. Elite.
Right. Good. Take us through your top tips then, girls. Like, what's next?
Yeah, so there's lots of things, or there's lots of considerations for reaching this kind of 6 to 8 if you're short course, or 10 to 12 if you're long course distance athlete. So these are kind of my top 5 tips and things to consider when you are maybe initially picking out some of your carb loading strategies. So number probably 1, these aren't in any kind of order of importance, but number 1 is making sure that you're avoiding foods high in fat and high in fiber. The main reason for this is they are the number 1 cause, or one of the main causes, of GI symptoms in athletes. They also can slow down digestion or speed up digestion, and therefore it's just potentially going to cause you issues that you don't need. And they're not going to have any benefit to you in terms of race day anyway. So just trying to omit them as much as possible is great. Naturally, with the carb load, some of the items that you might turn to might have a bit of fat in them, which is fine. For example, the Oreos will still have some fat in them, but if you minimize, or you look out for trying to keep that fat intake as low as possible, that would be my main thing. And then, as much as I would say eat the rainbow kind of every other day of the week around training, the day before your carb load is very, very beige. Bright colours if you're having sweets, obviously, but you don't need to have all the fruits and all the vegetables. Like I say, they're high in fibre and potentially going to give you a little bit of GI distress on race day, which is just not what you need after all that kind of preparation for racing. The aim, again, I'm talking about kind of the speed that some of these are digested, is you want to have foods that are high in glycemic index. Now, all that means is the amount of time it takes for them to basically be incorporated into your system is a lot faster. So therefore, it means that you're not going to feel as full for as longer. It means that you'll be able to eat more food. So that means you can get more carbs in, which we know is what we want before race day. So thinking of things like your white rice, bread, pasta, all of those kind of more white kind of carbohydrates tend to be higher GI items for choice. Don't forget that when we're talking about kind of carb loading, and I probably should have put something about this in now in hindsight, but we want to make sure we get into the start line hydrated. So you don't actually need to consume all your carbs through food. I use orange juice, for example. I don't know if you do anything with like fluids, but using fluids is a great way to keep hydration, also aid in your carb load as well. So don't forget you can drink your carbs as well as consuming them through whole food sources.
Just on a final note there with hydration, the other reason it's important with your carbohydrate load is for every gram of glycogen that you need to store. I think is it 3 grams of water that you need to make that efficient? So yeah, staying hydrated is really important during this process as well. So an emphasis there.
Make sure you practice. I really can't stress this enough, because we see it so much at finish lines where people are like, oh, I think I ate too much yesterday, or I didn't feel good when I woke up this morning. I think I ate too much pasta last night. Make sure you practice it and you get whatever strategy you're going to use nailed before what might be like one of your biggest races of the year, because you'll be annoyed when you get to the finish line and it wasn't your best performance, that your training didn't reflect race day because you did something like leaving carb loading out and you left it to the last minute and then you had a disaster on the day. So make sure you're practicing. And then another thing that I want to emphasize, which I've just touched upon in the last bullet point, is that you see a lot of like, oh, I'm having a pasta party tonight. I think even like the Ironman events put on pasta parties, don't they? Like the night before the race. And I would almost say that's like the wrong way to be approaching a carb load. So when we're thinking about carb loading, you need the trade-off between getting the right amount of carbs, not feeling too bloated, and sleep. If you try and shovel down as much pasta as you can possibly consume 2 hours before you go to bed, that's going to affect your sleep, and you're probably going to feel bloated the next day. So actually, when you think about when you're thinking about carbohydrate loading, you don't want your carbohydrate intake to look like this on the screen, where you've got actually the majority of the carbs are coming at the end of the day. What you need to do is you need to think, actually, what can I do first thing in the morning to get as many of the carbs that I need? If I need 500 grams or if I need 800 grams, how much of that is feasible for me to get in the morning, so that actually there's not any catch up to play, because you've also got to think about if you've got a check in to T1, if you've got a split transition. I remember my first ever 70.3 that I did was at Stas, and that was a split transition. That took up maybe 3 hours to go to both transition areas. So actually, if you've got the majority of your carb loading, or you've done a great deal of the carb loading before you leave the house, you're not then coming home and thinking, oh no, I've only eaten 100 grams of carbs and a few Haribos and I've still got X amount to have. So these are all things that you need to think about prior to race day. So try and have as much carbohydrates at breakfast and your snacks first thing in the morning will allow you to not feel massively full when you go to bed. You'll have better sleep and you're going to feel better on race morning. So those are kind of my top tips for carb loading. Do you think I've missed anything, Em, or is there anything you want to add?
Don't think so. I think you've got it all there.
Perfect. So here's an example. We've obviously mentioned a few already, and I've stolen this off one of the other 10 nutritionists pictures of what a carbohydrate load might look like, or what items you might kind of go to for that. So on the screen, like I've mentioned, you've got your white bread, you've got your white pasta. This person's obviously having Rice Krispies, probably for breakfast, which is a high carb. I know a lot of people use like rice puddings. They're great for like a high carb intake. There's custard there, sweets, and all of these things. Tin peaches is a good one that we kind of use in our carb loading plans. But all of these are these simple high GI carbohydrate foods, because we can rapidly digest them. They're incorporated into the system very quickly. They're typically lower in fiber, which then means we're getting that trade-off of getting as many carbs as we can in, not leaving us feeling bloated, or fall or feeling a bit sick and on the day before kind of a race. So this is just an example of a carb loading day of what you might eat.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of food when you put it like that, doesn't it? But
yeah, and I think maybe I should have put like a day in the life of a carb load or something to show people how much kind of food you would need to have to reach maybe 700 grams of carbs. It's definitely doable, but you do have to be like strategic, and yeah, it is potentially a lot of food, which kind of lends us nicely onto the next part of the talk. So part 2 was all around kind of training the gut. And what I wanted to do is, again, to give you a break from my voice for a bit, is if you can use the Q&A section of the Zoom, and Em's going to keep an eye on it, just 1 minute, I want you to try and guess the world record for the number of hot dogs consumed in 10 minutes. This is including the bread bun that surrounds the sausage. 10 minutes, how many hot dogs do you think someone can eat? What's the world record?
I'll keep an eye on the answers coming in.
Let's see if anyone's brave enough to put an answer.
Someone's put 35. That's the first guess we've had. Someone's put 130, so going big there. 67. It's coming in. Someone's put 30. For a few more guesses. Mm-hmm. 50. Everyone's got a range, 47.
The lowest we've had is 35 and the highest is 130, did you say?
30, highest is 130. A few people are sitting around that like 50 to high 60s mark.
Yeah, it's not a bad guess, to be fair. Fab, right. So the answer is, and I think there's somebody that's probably got very close to this number, so well done to whoever this is. So the answer is 69. So the world record for the amount of hot dogs that can be consumed in 10 minutes currently stands at 69. And you're probably thinking, why on earth is she telling me this? How is this relevant? But I'm going to talk to you about why this is important, or how they've got to the point of being able to eat 69 hot dogs. So it kind of shows that our gut is this organ, like our muscles, that can be adapted if we train it. And to be able to consume 69 hot dogs in 10 minutes, which is madness in my mind.
Impressive.
Yeah, it's crazy. And the speed that they have to eat them at is just like a whole nother skill as well. But anyway, competitive eaters have to use a variety of methods to kind of obtain like this stomach extension to be able to hold 69 hot dogs in their gut at one time. And I think this nicely shows that when people say, oh, I had these issues, or I've consumed too much or not enough, that in the most case, they've just not taken the time to get their gut to adapt to what they want them to do, because ultimately you can actually eat 69 hot dogs. So having a few of gels or chews or whatever might be of choice is a feasible strategy, and hitting 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight is feasible if you're doing that over a 24-hour period. But we still kind of get to these finish lines, and a common thing that people said, and I've already said this, is, oh, I had really bad GI issues, really bad stomach issues. And it's probably one of the main reasons that people don't reach their full potential when they're doing these longer distance races, where nutrition becomes extremely, extremely important. So there's lots of effects that training the gut can have on. It can increase the rate at which we can empty our stomach. It improves the absorption of the carbohydrates that we might be ingesting during the race. It can actually improve the amount of comfort. So over time, you can train your stomach to obviously withstand the amount that you need, so you don't feel you don't have those levels of discomfort that you might have previously. And then it obviously can then lead to the reduction in GI issues that people then report to have during racing, for example.
The only other thing I'd just add to that is the other kind of benefit from the gut is actually just like a reduction in anxiety as well, because so many people get stressed about having GI symptoms. It can actually cause them. So if you're practicing it in training and stuff, you can actually reduce that like anxiety response to it, because you can feel more confident in your approach, can't you?
Yeah, no, 100%. That's a great point, that actually there is now
Like,
proven a link between your brain and your gut. So if you're stressing about GI symptoms, it's kind of more likely that it's also going to happen, which is obviously not ideal. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you for the next kind of 10 minutes or so on how we can train the gut, what methods and strategies we can kind of use that will then allow you to do things like hit your carb load, for example. So the first things to consider, or the three kind of key areas to kind of pinpoint, is for you to do this effectively, you need to have good day-to-day nutrition for the most part, because this will allow a better tolerance. You need to be strategic in which sessions you're choosing to do this. So people will practice carb loading, they'll also practice in-race nutrition, which I've tried really hard not to touch upon because I don't want to spoil Harvey's talk, but people will go out and do their zone 2 rides and they'll go and practice their carbs. That's great. You know you can withstand that amount of carbs, but it's very different doing a zone 3 hours zone 2 than it might be doing 3 hours at 70.3 pace. So you've got to make sure that you're being strategic in the sessions that you're using. You need to train your gut at the intensities that you're also going to be racing at. And the last point that I've kind of said a couple of times now, but ideally, you want a bare minimum of 8 weeks. I'd say more like 12, because you're going to have weeks where you might want to tweak things. You might have a B race that you want to practice at. You might have a recovery week, or you might get injured or ill where you have a week or 2 off. So actually making sure you've got a good 10 to 12 week block before you can actually implement this into racing itself is really important to getting this right. Some people are fine. Some people will go, consumed it 10 grams per kilo. I didn't like this. Can we swap for something else? And it's 2 or 3 weeks and it's fine. But for the majority of people, I would say, especially in endurance sports where people don't tend to fuel with the amount of carbohydrates in training correctly anyway, most people will underfuel. That's quite common. Then getting you to consume 10 to 12 grams per kilo or 90 plus grams of carbs per hour during a race, trying to do that after someone's been underfueling can have these kind of bigger impacts on the gut and the stomach and how you might feel in response to that. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the methods that you might want to use or how you might use them. And hopefully between me and them, we might flick through some examples of how you might do some of these strategies. So method number 1 is training with relatively large volumes of fluid. So the idea of this is that obviously you want to be hydrating. We can also put carbs in our drinks as well, so we need to practice that. We also need to remember that actually when we're running, we've got the mechanical like up and down kind of bouncing movement, so drinking on the go and that sitting in your stomach will feel very different. So like I said before, not doing all of this kind of on your zone 2 runs and focusing it on 70.3 Ironman sprint standard distance pace efforts is really important. It's going to actually allow your stomach to withstand greater amounts of fluid on race day. Anything to add, Em?
Obviously, it's not always going to feel the most comfortable, but unfortunately, it's part of the process.
Yeah, get comfortable being uncomfortable. The whole of triathlon, even with nutrition. Number 2, a really great strategy to try out. And this is probably great. Loads of age groupers love this because they're so busy with time anyway. So it's just another way to kind of cut some time out somewhere. Is train immediately after a meal. Now, you might want to start maybe a bit smaller with the meal first, whilst you're getting used to it. And then you can almost have bigger meals and build up how much you're consuming before you then do the training. One, you'll get used to the discomfort, but two, like we said, if your stomach can adapt to eating 69 hot dogs in 10 minutes, it can probably adapt to having a meal before you jump on the bike, for example. So that's another good strategy that you can use. Training with a high carbohydrate intake, I've put in brackets for you because don't compare yourself to what other people do. That's another thing people try and get wrong, get right, but do wrong during exercise. So remember some of the guidelines, and like Harvey will talk to you about this, so I don't want to spoil it, but the guidelines for the amount of carbs that you need is quite high during racing. Some people might choose to almost overfuel on the bike leg so they don't have to have as much during the run. So making sure that you're pushing up your carbohydrate intake throughout the weeks leading up to the race, and even going over can be a really sensible approach to try and train your gut to withstand the amount of carbs that you might need. And if you don't have an idea of where to start, I would probably think about what you normally have a look at the carbohydrate content on the back of that, and then almost adding a small amount on each week. So you're not going from like 30 to 60, you're not doubling the amount of carbs. Little increments every week, work backwards for how many weeks you might have for the race and go, let's see how far up I can get on kind of the carbohydrate intake. Obviously, race day stimulation practice. There's no point having all your carbs or hitting these great carbohydrate intakes if you're only doing them running a zone 1 or zone 2 recovery aerobic, whatever your sport may be, kind of session. So make sure when you have those kind of key brick sessions and you've got race stimulation sessions, or you've got a set that's, I don't know, 5x8 at some sort of power that's relevant to race, that those are the ones that you need to practice. You'll also feel great during those sessions as well. So you'll be able to hit the sessions much easier. And you'll also feel, okay, good, I can hold that for that power at that intensity, so I should be fine on the day of the race.
The only thing I would kind of add so far is also like trying to start you can have some solid food during training as well, just to mix up from gels, because then it's a bit more pressure on your stomach in a way to actually digest. So that can also be done to train the gut, especially if you're considering having actual food on race day, then that's obviously 100%. But even if you're not, it can still be beneficial to, yeah, train your gut with actual food as well as just the energy gels.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then the last kind of main one is something that you could literally put into practice at any point, is actually just increasing the amount of carbohydrates that you're having in general day to day. So it's really common, especially when we start working with our athletes, that actually the number one reason why they might be struggling or they feel like they're not progressing in their training is that actually they're massively underfueling on the amount of carbohydrates they actually should be consuming. So most people would benefit from this in their training anyway, but obviously this also adds to this training the gut philosophy of actually our stomach can withhold or withstand more carbohydrates on race day if we're generally having a higher carbohydrate diet in general. So these are kind of the main ones that have been picked out as terms of the best methods to use and how we might use them to kind of train our gut for performance. Some of the potential effects that this has. So you're going to then reduce the amount of bloating and fullness that you feel when you train your gut during exercise, which is ideal because nobody wants to feel extremely bloated or extremely full. You definitely will still have some aspect of that, but it will feel a lot more manageable if you've been training the gut appropriately. It will increase that rate of gastric emptying I mentioned earlier. Again, less discomfort. We can increase our capacity to absorb carbohydrates. So the guidelines that we have are that actually they're aimed more at well-trained individuals. people that are maybe a little bit less trained will have a decreased kind of ability to absorb the carbs. But also as time goes on, when you do these strategies, you can increase your capacity to absorb carbohydrates. That can be really handy if you're trying to maybe eat less or consume less carbohydrates on the run. If you know that running kind of sets you off with those GI issues, if you can increase more earlier on, that's going to have a greater benefit for you later down the line. It increases the delivery of the carbohydrates. And then ultimately, the main things that we get from this is people experience less of these symptoms that I keep banging on about. And ultimately, increasing your amount of carbs that you can have will improve performance, and you'll feel much better because you can improve performance without having loads of stomach issues. So it's kind of a win-win situation in terms of the methods that we use and the impact that that can have on the way you feel and the way that you also perform.
Perfect. So thanks so much for going into so much detail there as well, Kels. I think everyone will have benefited from that. So what would you say you kind of take away or take home messages, whatever you want to call it? Use take away for a pun if we want, but yeah, what would we finish off with, do you think?
So my number one is that consuming carbohydrates or increasing carbohydrate intake has been shown in so many research papers now and in enough people to say that this definitely will have a benefit on performance. Carbohydrate loading itself needs to focus on kind of those high GI foods that are rapidly digested so we don't get as much discomfort. You'll need to train your gut to do this, and in doing so, you need to make sure you're giving yourself, I would say, at least 12 weeks to make sure that you are in a place where you're confident and you're not stressed that you can't do this carb load. So making sure you've practiced it a good few times before the actual race day itself, and making sure you're using kind of those B races where you might actually have a little bit of stress and anxiety to also make sure that your body's still responding in the same way before your big A race or your big competition. So those are kind of my key take-home messages.
Cool. So I think if you go on to your next slide, I think it's just to remind everyone of your next week's session is hydration and electrolytes. Obviously, don't go anywhere just yet because we're going to go through some questions. Just as I am organising these sessions, I wanted to point out we've got another one next week on hydration electrolytes for training and racing. So please, if you haven't already signed up, come along. I'm sure Vicky will have plenty of good things to say. But yeah, let's go on to questions. If you use the Q&A box to kind of type in, there's already been a few, but feel free to type away while we get started. So one of the first ones that came through right actually at the beginning when you were talking about our like fuel stores, Kels, you know, like in the muscle, someone has asked, can you make your fuel tank bigger?
As in, can you essentially increase the amount of carbs that you would consume as a result? It's a good question.
I think it's in actual like storage, can you make your fuel tank bigger? That's the
So
I'm taken away from it anyway, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, the person who's asked the question.
So your tank or your storage sites are your muscles, your liver, for example. So in essence, unless your muscles are growing, technically no. But what we do see over time is that the more you do this kind of training the gut, increasing carbohydrate intake, you can actually increase the rate at which you absorb your fuel and you then deliver that fuel to the tank. So I think for most people, the primary focus should be, before I do long or short distance racing, am I hitting between 6 to 8, 10 to 12 grams per kilogram, 24 to 72 hours before the race? Am I doing that consistently? Have I done that over a process of weeks, months? I would say, like, our carb load strategies have definitely evolved over the years that we've been in the sport, because ultimately enhancing the absorption and the delivery is more important than the size of the tank per se. So getting kind of the loading and the practice, I think, is the most important aspect of that.
Yeah, and I think it's also just important to mention that the people who are training here as well are more likely to be able to, probably have a bigger fuel tank just because of your training. Like, it is a bit of a training adaptation if we compare to untrained individuals. They're not going to store like carbohydrate as efficiently because their body doesn't need it the same. So there is like that training difference. But yeah, can you increase it through training? So and so, probably agree with Kels. Unless you keep getting bigger muscles, then I guess you
Yeah.
more space for storage.
Yeah, that's it. If you're getting bigger muscles, then you're going to weigh more. So that just pushes, like, that's like the, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, cool. One of the other questions we had, which I think we because it came in before we discussed this section, so we've kind of discussed it, kind of not, but someone was asking, what's the evidence in your opinion of tapering your carb load? So the day before the race, you'd eat as normal to prevent feeling too full on a race day, but still carb load like -2, -3 days away from the race. Is it still effective in maximizing glycogen stores by race day? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I'd say it's still effective to do, but I'd say it's not optimal. So we use glycogen overnight for body processes, basic physiological functioning. So if you were then going back to kind of eating normal and not maximizing the amount that you can store, I imagine you're probably going to get to the start line a little bit suboptimal. It's still better than like no carb load at all, because obviously you've got 2 days there where you're loading as much carbohydrates as you can. But I would almost ask the question of, what is the carbohydrate loading strategy you're using the day before that's leading you to kind of feel full? Because I think for most people, it's definitely possible to do a lot of the loading. And are you shifting that, or can you shift most of your carb load to first thing in the morning? Because that's still 24 hours before you're actually starting your race, which is enough time.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was getting at about like what we'd already discussed. Is I guess we already have kind of said that to front load the carb load through the day, and that's what we'd recommend. But yeah, I agree with you completely there, Kels. And yeah, let's question why you might feel a bit uncomfortable afterwards, and can we make any changes to it? Are there any other questions? If so, please send them in. But in the meantime, just to point out that if anyone wants more personalized advice, specific to your event, I know someone mentioned they were a runner as well. I've already, they put what's the equivalent for a runner when you were talking about 70.3 and Ironman carbo. So
I'm sorry.
the answer, and I said just compare it to like the 70.3 distance-ish, probably a little bit under, but yeah, so we've got a few different people on board. But if you do want more personalized advice, please reach out to one of the Total Endurance Nutrition team, and one of us will be happy to help, I am sure. But if there are no more questions, I will stop the recording.
Yeah, that's my naivety being very specific to triathlon, but yeah.
Not at all. We covered everything fine. Right, I'm gonna stop the recording now.